In very basic terms, the multiverse theory states that every time you make a decision, you create a branch reality or parallel universe. Some of these would be almost imperceptible from your reality, such as a universe where you turned left at a fork in the road instead of right. But some universes could be total hellscapes due to infinitesimal changes. Hello, I'm Andrew Boyd, and though my decisions have led me to being trapped in this dark, barren universe that is as vast as space and as timeless as infinity, I do count myself lucky that I have not found myself in any of the top 5 terrifying parallel universes we pray are not real. Number 5. The universe where a death ray was unleashed on the English countryside. Our first disturbing universe was formed in March 2002 when a truck transporting medical equipment in North England made a series of disastrous mistakes. The truck was carrying a 2.5-ton piece of highly radioactive equipment that the workers had forgotten to plug one end of before putting it in the vehicle. As a result, the equipment was projecting a narrow radioactive beam that was measured to be between 100 and 1,000 times above the safe level. Fortunately for our universe, the workers chose to put the equipment in the truck vertically, causing the beam to shoot 1,000 feet directly into the sky, thus preventing harm to anyone other than perhaps a few birds. But the multiverse theory supports the idea that there is a universe where the workers chose to place the leaky equipment into the truck horizontally before setting out on their drive. In this universe, the truck would be projecting a 1,000-foot beam of lethal radiation that would affect anyone whose vehicle or home they passed on their journey to dispose of the equipment. In our universe, the company responsible was prosecuted and fined £151,000, with prosecutors saying that the only thing that had prevented anyone from being seriously contaminated had been pure good fortune. But in the multiverse, this good fortune was nowhere to be found when it was most needed. Number 4. Death from above. Our next entry on our list of awful parallel universes takes us to the Kamido area of Japan in the summer of 1993. The area was home to the headquarters of a religious cult called the Aum Shinrikyo, who believed that doomsday was fast approaching and that their leader could transfer spiritual powers to his followers and absolve them of their sins. It was founded in 1987, but it was not long before some of its members turned to violence. On the day in question, residents of the area began complaining of a strange smell in the air. By the next day, several of the locals began feeling ill and suffered from nausea and vomiting. The day after that, the cause of the sickness was discovered, and authorities discovered that the cult was using a device on the roof of their headquarters to spray a mist in the air that was leaving an oily black substance on the nearby buildings. The authorities were eventually able to convince the cultists to turn off the machine and pack up their operation, and the situation seemed to be resolved. 2 years later, the cultists used sarin gas to attack a subway station, and the authorities decided to study the oily black residue that had been left in the bizarre 1993 incident. Upon analysis, they discovered that the cloud that had been released over the city by the cultists' device was aerosolized anthrax. Fortunately for the inhabitants of the city in our universe, the cultists grabbed the wrong type of anthrax and instead used a strain that had been developed for vaccinations. So instead of doing any long-term harm to the city's residents, they only suffered from nausea and were actually immunized against the disease. But if every decision creates a branch reality, then there is a universe where this cult did not make this mistake, and were able to pump thousands of gallons of lethal gas into a cloud over one of the most densely populated areas on Earth, resulting in one of the most lethal attacks in history. Even worse than this, the failure of the anthrax to work in our universe led the cultists to use a different, less dangerous gas in their future attacks. In a universe where this method was successful, they likely would have continued using the far more lethal substance in their subsequent attacks. Number 3. The San Fernando earthquake of 1971. On February 9th, 1971, the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains were struck by a sudden and unanticipated earthquake that was so powerful that it measured a 6.5 on the seismic magnitude scales. The earthquake lasted about 60 seconds, but the damage it caused was catastrophic. It resulted in millions of dollars of property damage, with multiple hospitals collapsing, multiple freeways being damaged by the shifting ground, around, and by landslides. By the end of the earthquake, over 2,500 people were injured, and 64 people lost their lives. It is hard to imagine this massive earthquake being any worse, but if we are to believe the multiverse theory, where anything that could happen has, then there is a universe where this earthquake was the worst disaster in US history. The earthquake caused the nearby Van Norman Reservoir to suffer intense damage, with the top 30 feet of the dam disintegrating. If the reservoir hadn't only been half full, or half empty depending on your perspective, a massive flood would have been unleashed on the valley below. In our rather fortunate universe, the water stayed a mere 6 feet from the top of the damaged dam. The aftershocks of the earthquake did, however, cause the dam to continue to crumble, and as a result, the next 3 days were spent evacuating 80,000 people from the area as the dam remained standing thanks to only a few feet of freeboard. In a universe where the reservoir had been more full of water, or where this last 6 feet of dam had failed, the valley would have been flooded, and as a UCLA study later determined, a minimum of 71,600 and possibly up to 123,400 people would have perished in the resulting flood. That is more victims than Pearl Harbor, the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, 9/11, and the 1900 Galveston hurricane incidents combined. Number 2. A universe where the Axis won the Second World War. In war, the slightest miscalculation can spell defeat in a battle that can lead to an army losing an entire war. There were several decisions made by both the Allied and Axis forces during World War II that could have swayed the war in a different direction. For example, in 1940, a large segment of the British government wanted to make peace with the Germans rather than fight them. In 1941, Russia almost fell, and German troops made it within 40 miles of Moscow. The Germans made the mistake of turning on the Soviet Union in 1941, resulting in the Soviet Union becoming one of the most powerful armies in the Allied forces. Japan made the mistake of attacking Pearl Harbor, and thereby drawing the United States' massive army into the conflict. With so many spinning plates, it's not hard to imagine that there may be a universe where the Allies lost the Second World War. But what would that look like? Renowned historian Gerhard L. Weinberg looked at the hints from each country's heads of state about how they had envisioned a post-war world, and used these clues to construct a general vision of what this world would look like. Nordic countries such as Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and the German-speaking regions of Switzerland would have been annexed by Germany. The government that they set up in Poland was set to inherit half of the Soviet Union, with the rest being promised to Japan. This would, however, be short-lived, as Germany planned to conquer Japan once they ceased to be useful in the conflict. Mussolini was promised the required lands to rebuild most of the Roman Empire, with the exception of France and Great Britain, which were to be left under German control. Due to the attitudes of the South Africans, it was anticipated that they would choose to support the German cause, and satellite governments were to be installed in Spain and Portugal. Details on how they planned on dealing with the United States are slim, but it seems they were being saved for last, with hopes of all the conquered countries being added to the German war machine, which should have been enough to conquer them through combined sheer force. Far more disturbing than the new geographical lines that would be drawn were the planned policies. Of course, the Germans planned on eliminating ethnic groups and people they deemed inferior in every conquered area. They also planned on eliminating Christianity and introducing a state policy of polygamy, so that German soldiers could more effectively rebuild the population that was being lost to the war. A universe where all this came to pass is terrifying, but considering how far behind Germany's nuclear program was in comparison to both the Soviet Union and the United States, it is just as likely that had the war continued on, it would have escalated to a nuclear threat. But in the infinite possibilities of the multiverse, either outcome is not only possible, but inevitable, thus creating multiple universes where the brutality and bloodshed continued on, resulting in the forces of evil being victorious and instilling their will on the world. Number 1. The branch reality created by Stanislav Petrov. The final entry on our list is a perfect example of how one decision made by one man can change the course of history and the lives of everyone on the planet in a matter of moments. It takes us to the height of the Cold War between the USSR and the United States in September of 1983. Soviet Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was the officer on duty monitoring the Soviet Union's missile attack early warning system. Tensions had recently escalated between the Soviets and the States, with President Ronald Reagan taking a much more hardline stance against the Soviets than his predecessors had, and increasing the United States' nuclear capabilities in both West Germany and Great Britain. On this particular day, a horrified Petrov watched as the early warning system began flashing the word launch launch in flashing bright red lights. The computer had determined with high reliability that 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles had been launched and were headed right for them. It was here that Petrov had a choice to make. If he reported this, the country's nuclear doctrine stated that they would immediately launch a counterattack against the states with nuclear arms of their own, with no time to double-check the system or negotiate with the American. If the computer was right, then missiles were headed right for him and his homeland. If the computer was wrong and they launched a needless attack on the states, they would be devastated by the blast and send a counterattack of their own. Fortunately for us, in our universe, Petrov chose not to report this incident and soon discovered that the missiles were actually sunlight reflecting off of a cloud and messing with the computer's sensors. However, in a universe where Petrov decided to follow protocol and report the incoming strike, the Soviet Union would have launched their missiles at the United States, resulting in between 35 and 77% of the country's population being destroyed, and 20 to 40% of the Soviet population being lost in the inevitable counterstrike. An additional 2 billion people would have likely starved due to the environmental devastation caused by the incident, making this one of the most important crossroads ever encountered in the history of the universe. The malevolent forces that run this dark dimension have asked me to warn you that the decision to not like, comment, and subscribe could result in the creation of a dystopian parallel universe where everything you love is taken away. So for your own sake, act accordingly. Perhaps our paths will cross again soon, and I can regale you with more tales of the macabre and the disturbing here on Top 5 Scary Videos. But if we are to